I'm Sandra Wills, the PVC Student Learning. I feel like I'm still new to CSU because this morning I went around with Diana to look at the beautiful veterinary science clinic and of course the dentistry clinics here. I think one of the signature ways of teaching at CSU is the highly authentic practice-based learning spaces that have been built particularly in science, and I wanted to show that off to Diana, but I also wanted to see them myself. So this morning we've been looking at MRIs of horses and echidnas in the veterinary science clinic, and yesterday, thanks to Tim West, we also went to a Wiradjuri class with the graduate certificate in Wiradjuri language and culture, which was very enlightening, so thank you to Tim West for showing us that. This is the first time that Diana's been to CSU, so that's why I was keen to show off our bits and pieces in what we could in the 2 or 3 days she's here. Diana has been to Australia many times, but this is her first time to Wiradjuri country, so welcome to Wiradjuri country. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodian of the lands on which CSU campuses are located. So that's the Wiradjuri, Ngunnawal, Gundungurra and Biripi peoples of Australia and the Haudenosaunee peoples of Canada. And I'm reminded that now with the launch of our virtual campus, we need to modify our acknowledgement of country because we have students that are not just in these lands but other lands further aflung. So CLTC has taken that on board to negotiate a revised acknowledgement of country in anticipation of a refreshed approach to distance education, which is what we're here to hear this morning from Diana Laurillard. We are refreshing our CSU's distance education strategy. The slogan we've got going for that at the moment is doing DE differently. And I've invited Diana to speak to us this morning because I did see this presentation from Diana in Singapore last year, and I thought it'd address some key issues very succinctly about if we wanted to expand in DE, if we wanted to teach at scale, what would we need to make sure we had in place? How can we make sure that we support students adequately in a massively scaled up DE? Not sure that we're doing massive, but that's the thing that we would like to address. So thank you to Diana and welcome to CSU. I'm really pleased to have Diana here. As I said, our paths have crossed many years over the decades. We were this morning talking over breakfast how we're both digital natives from the 70s on different sides of the world, but our careers have sort of converged at this stage. So I'll hand over to Diana for talking about designing supported learning for large-scale classes. Thank you, Diana.
Thank you very much. Do I need to worry about a microphone or anything? It's all right, is it? Mic'd up and you can hear okay? Excellent, okay. Well, thank you very much for a charming welcome, Sandra, and for the opportunity to come to CSU for the first time, having been to quite a few different universities in Australia over the years and always enjoyed my visits. I think the first time I came to Australia, I came for about 3 months, and I was charmed by the outspokenness of Australian academics. You could always get a good debate going. To the extent that by the time I got to the end of the 3 months, I was actually longing for a bit of British hypocrisy. It was just sort of unadulterated outspokenness. But that's the charm of the place, actually. So I'm going to plan to leave about half an hour or so for Q&A, and I expect that to be challenging comments as well as questions, whatever you want to throw at me. Okay, so. Yes, so we're talking about designing supported learning for large-scale classes, and I think one of the challenges that we all face, and what's so interesting is it doesn't matter which country or which kind of university I'm going to, it's clear that we're all facing the same kinds of issues and difficulties as we're trying to make the best of new technology, trying to understand how best to serve our students, trying to work out how best to expand access to higher education, which wherever we teach in the world is still expensive and it still tends to be a highly privileged opportunity for people. So to what extent will we be using new technology to enhance what we do, but also to extend the opportunities for higher education to more people? So the issue of supporting learning in larger scale classes does become critical to being able to do that. just roughly going through the outline, therefore, given that I'm talking about large scale and economies of scale that you can achieve from that, I thought that looking at the economics of teaching and learning in higher education is a good place to start, and thinking about balancing the learning benefits against the teaching costs. Because whenever we move into new technology, there's always the expectation that it's all going to be cheaper. My finance director said to me the other day, of course, when you go online, it's all cheaper, isn't it? Well, no, not necessarily. And it's very important to understand the reasons why it's not necessarily cheaper and how we get that benefit of economies of scale and greater productivity. So that's going to be part of what I'm trying to focus on. And therefore, looking at the pedagogies for the large scale, what it takes to teach with technology, because it's different. Teachers are doing very different things when you teach with technology. Looking at smart learning environments, a lot of people are talking about smart learning environments now, and it's intriguing to see that you have a smart course design process here. So I think that gels with that very well. And coming down to looking at what it means to analyze the learning benefits and the teaching costs of what we're doing with technology, and then ending up with some summary and implications and a question. So looking at the economics of teaching and learning in higher education, I want to separate what we do as teachers into the preparation of the curriculum and resources, the design, the development, all of that, which goes on prior to the encounter with students, and then the support for students' learning, which is what goes on while the students are learning, and the support that we give, the guidance, the marking, grading of exams, accreditation, all of that, which is the variable student-related costs. So if we think in terms of, here's a selection of the kinds of teaching learning activities we might do. And I've categorized them, roughly speaking, into adaptive systems, expositions, presentations, delivery of information and ideas, formative assessment, down to tutor discussion, summative assessment. The black examples are the traditional, conventional things we've been doing for years and years, and the green ones are the kind of digital versions of those traditional, conventional teaching methods and resources. And we could think of those as being different kinds of teaching costs. The first lot, fixed cost, the second lot, variable cost. And the fixed cost means that you create it once, you can use it many times. If you write a book, it can be good for 20 students, but it could be equally good for 20,000 students, or if you're lucky, 20 million students. Whereas tutorials, guidance, marking, advice, negotiation with students, all of those sorts of things are variable costs. So they change with the number of students you have. So you run a tutorial for 10 students. It's not the same as running a tutorial for 100 students, or even for 20, actually. Once you get above about 10, it's a very different kind of student experience. So those are different kinds of teaching approach. And if you think in terms of the cost, the fixed costs of developing things like adaptive systems, lab sessions, field trips, those are pretty expensive, upfront fixed costs. When you get down to things like devising an exam question, it doesn't take nearly as long to devise an exam question as it does to create a field trip or something like that. So this is not to scale, of course, but broadly speaking, you've got high fixed costs for some things, low fixed costs for other things. But it also works the other way around, because marking and grading and things of that kind are a high variable cost. To spend a lot of time for each student in marking their exams or marking their essays or marking their projects or whatever. Whereas for the adaptive systems, if you've got a simulation that students are running over and over again by themselves, you have no part in that. You've created it, and now off they go and they use it. Same for something like a podcast or a masterclass or something like that. You've got the video, 20,000 people can use it, doesn't concern you at all. It'll be the same as if 20 people are consuming it. So it's an important difference between the different kinds of activity that teachers do. So if we want to think about balancing the benefits and costs, then looking at that relationship between what we're doing for the student experience in terms of each one of those things is very important, and understanding how the staff time relates to what we're doing with those different kinds of things is important. And if we want to try and work on a larger scale, we want to give more students access to higher education, if we want to extend distance education opportunities, if we want to bring more people to the campus on an occasional basis, perhaps, and the larger scale we're going, we need to be looking at whether the extent to which new technologies can help us with shifting this variable cost support to fixed cost support. That would be one way in which we gain economies of scale. So there's an underlying question here: can we develop a viable business model that will make higher education more effective and affordable for undergraduates? So this is not about cutting costs. It's not about giving people more work to do. It's all about seeing how we can make each one of us as teachers more productive for the benefit of reducing the overall cost to the student, because it's very expensive. And if we think about the scale of demand for higher education across the world, there are millions of students, especially in developing economies, who want access to higher education and got no hope of it because of the cost of what we do and the model that we run at the moment. Is there another way of doing it, is one overarching question. That's a universal question, but even at the individual institutional level, we've all got that commitment to trying to broaden access to higher education. So thinking about some of the pedagogies for supporting larger classes, I think it's worth thinking back to some of the things that we've always done traditionally. And as I spent 20 years at the Open University in the UK, which is a pretty large-scale distance education institution, we would have courses of many thousands of students and would run summer schools at which we would have large groups of students working together, working collaboratively. And some of the tricks we used to use were these kinds of things like the Keller Plan, the Vicarious Masterclass, pyramid discussion groups. Now I'll explain a little bit about what each of these were. The Keller Plan was something which I actually came across when I first started as a maths lecturer in a polytechnic, where lectures were to 70 students who came from probably about 65 different countries, qualified at all sorts of things other than the A-level that I was used to. So there was a very wide range of diversity of capability. And lecturing was really, really difficult. So the Keller Plan idea, which came from large-scale teaching in the States originally, was that instead of having a 50-minute lecture, you would have something like a 10 or 15-minute lecture to introduce the content, and then everybody would be working on self-paced practice. So I had to prepare some self-teaching materials which students would work through. And when the first student had got through the material, they would take a test, and then when they were ready, they would come up and get marked by me. And the quicker students were usually the better students, of course, and they would then become tutors. So as further students finished and did the test, they would come up and get marked and then become tutors. So that you had this constant creation of new student tutors, marking and supporting the other students who were coming up. And if I was really lucky, I would get half the class tutoring the other class, the other half by the end of the hour. Didn't always work like that, but I mean, basically, it was a very good way of enabling every student in that 70-strong class to work at their own pace, to be able to get some support from somebody else, and if they were a bit quicker, to reinforce the learning they'd done by teaching somebody else. So it wasn't a bad technique. And it was good enough that even after I left, it carried on. So that's the best evaluation of all. The Vicarious Masterclass is the idea that when you're in a small group, and a music instrumental session would be a sort of obvious example. When the teacher is showing you how to fix your bowing because you're not holding your arm the right way, you're watching that, but that's quite valuable vicarious learning for you as well. If you're getting the fingering positions wrong in the way that you're playing an instrument, the teacher tells one person that, but everybody benefits from it. And that's the benefit of being taught in a group. The same thing could happen in the philosophy class. You're watching the way other students are interacting with the teacher. You're getting something out of that interaction. So why just 5 students? Why not record that and make that for 5,000 students? Because you have that same kind of vicarious experience of the way in which the teacher is interacting with you as you do if you're in that room, watching it going on. So that's another kind of way in which 5 students can represent a lot of students just by being the kinds of students who ask awkward questions, or who are not the most brilliant student, but they expose the kinds of misunderstandings which students have, the kind of misconceptions they have. So the masterclass, brilliant way of teaching, but why not have the vicarious masterclass as well? Could also work. And the pyramid discussion groups was what we used to do at the OU when we had very large groups and we wanted to get everybody thinking about a difficult idea. So you'd have everyone thinking on their own. So let's say you've got 240 students. You ask each one to think about a difficult idea, explain it, come up with an issue, or come up with an observation about it. And then they go into pairs and they compare their ideas and they come up with a better one. And then the pairs meet another pair and they debate until they've got an even better one. So you give them increasing amounts of time. Then when you've got larger groups, you get them to vote on what they think the best answer is, and so on, until you've got that large group producing 6 outputs from all of that discussion, which the teacher is then able to reflect on and give feedback on. So it would be impossible for me as a teacher to give feedback on 240 different ways of thinking about an issue. But 6 is feasible. So all of those students have experienced their own way of thinking about it, debating in a lot of debates and voting on what's the best answer of the ones coming out and so on. And that could again scale up to thousands of students if you get the technology running it the right way. So all of those old techniques that we used to use in very large classes, have always used, still use in these large classes, could all become digital versions in the way that we're doing it now. All too often we're not looking at those kinds of pedagogies that we all know very well. We're using new kinds of things like Moodles and VLEs and podcasts and all the things. MOOCs are the obvious new technologies, so-called, which are essentially just pointing a camera at the lecturer and they have a talking head again. It's back to talking heads. Well, let's think back to some of the other kinds of pedagogies that teachers have been very well aware of and very good at doing, and create digital versions of those, and thereby improve the kinds of pedagogies that we're offering. So those, in these slides, which will be made available to everybody, by the way, you see how old some of those are, the bibliographic details are all in there. So the idea is that we should be looking as much at the traditional pedagogies as we are at these new opportunities, but turning them into the ways in which we can redevelop them as forms of collaborative learning for students. So thinking about the roles and capabilities of the technology, there's a lot here to go through on the slide, but I just wanted to give a flavour of thinking about why should pedagogy improve just because we've got technology. And we can think of 6 different kinds of learning that are supported by new technologies. The quality of presentations is improved by all the different kinds of things that we can do with multimedia. So that's learning just through acquisition, just getting a sense of the story of the subject, the way in which the lecturer wants to explain it. The accessibility of resources aids inquiry learning, so it's possible for students to do much more of their own exploration of original and primary sources than they ever could before. That's a huge benefit to the authenticity of discovery of what's going on in your subject area, not to mention topicality, of course. Asynchronous discussion increases the ratio of student to staff talk. And that was something I noticed again at the OU in watching what was happening in a normal face-to-face tutorial with a tutor and 20 students. And then what was happening online in that same course, where the students would write yards and yards and yards of stuff, and the tutor would come in every so often with a small comment, and I just counted up the words that both uttered in those 2 different situations. And in the face-to-face tutorial, the ratio of tutor talk to student talk was 9:1. In the online asynchronous discussion group, it was the exact opposite. It was 1:9, because it was asynchronous, and because there was no word limit on what students could say. When you're in a small group with a tutor, you have a natural sense that you can't witter on for a couple of thousand words. When you're in an online discussion group, actually, we do limit the word lengths now, because some people write essays and these things. So So that simple fact of it being digital and asynchronous, and the students can think about their answer and can formulate their answer. They don't have to think up what's the sentence I'm going to say in this situation where I'm publicly exposing myself. It works very differently online. So those kinds of things are real opportunities where the technology makes a difference. Using digital models so that we're using microworlds, simulations, virtual worlds, that kind of thing, which emulate the practice that we're trying to get students to be able to do. Getting students to work in collaboration can be quite tricky. Getting a collaborative project going is quite hard. But if you can orchestrate it online by giving them a lot of information about the different roles they're going to play, the time they should take to do things, what kinds of tasks they could do, they may change those tasks and those sequences, but you're supporting, you're scaffolding, you're assisting that process, orchestrating that process to enable them to learn collaboratively from each other. And then the design tools that we all use as teachers, students can use also to articulate what they've learned. So a PowerPoint is an expression of my understanding of this particular area. Well, you can get the student to create a PowerPoint instead of writing an essay or something. Create a website. Create a video. All kinds of things which we can now ask students to do because of the kinds of design tools now available, which are the products that they create in order to tell us what they've learned. And then access is improved because we can now, using the internet, give wide access to the best lectures, so you get better quality content. You can spend more time on that one lecture because it will be repeated and amortized over many more students. Education comes to the students because, just in the same way as distance education does, so it can be more localized. Asynchronous presentation allows self-pacing. Scaffolding, anywhere and anytime learning allows greater flexibility of study. And in many cases, students are working their way through university, so they do need that greater flexibility of study. They don't have to be in the lecture theatre at a particular time. And the technology provides those support tools for diverse student needs because it can adapt, whether it's accessibility or whether it's giving students more support because of language difficulties or whatever it happens to be. So there are many ways in which the technology supports better pedagogy, supports better access for students, supports greater flexibility, and we need to try and establish all of those. So if we think about what it takes to teach with technology, that's an awful lot to learn and understand. And just this short list gives us a sense of all the different kinds of things that teachers are doing, planning how students will use that mix of the digital and the physical and the social learning spaces we're creating for them. Curating and adapting even the existing content resources, not just creating new ones, but even using what we've already got. Designing, personalized and adaptive teaching, providing flexibility, guiding and nurturing large cohorts and how you do that. Using learning technologies to improve scales and both scale and outcomes. So it's not a matter of going large and therefore the quality of the learning experience diminishes. It should, if anything, increase because of technology. Using learning analytics to inform the design of teaching and learning. So there's an immense amount for teachers to do. And in the process of curating and orchestrating, I think it's important to be thinking about the way in which we present this to the student. So just a few examples here of what the student sees when they're working through an online course. This is from a MOOC that we ran recently, so this is in the Coursera platform. And the Coursera platform typically has been used, which is one of the larger MOOC platforms, to say here's a list of video tutorials, and here's a list of quizzes you can do, and here's a list of forums that you can join to support this process. And that's pretty much what many of them offer. And what we tried to do in our MOOC was to provide that kind of scaffolded guidance of what you're doing here and what you should be looking for and why you should be doing it. So it's more of a kind of study guide sequence. And of course students will distort the sequence that you give them. I mean, they may well do. They'll jump all over the place. But they need to know what the default narrative sequence is. What's the optimal way to go through this material? So in this way, we're kind of orchestrating this process of watch this audio slide video and look out for this as you're watching it, and then join this forum, and then do this analysis and record it in your course journal and so on. So we're giving them the means by which they are expected to engage with what materials that we're offering. And it defines each activity as core to the course and as the optional extension, because students will select what they do. They will be very pushed for time, many of them, so they will be selective, so we may as well do that selection for them. So this is the core, this is the extension. And we always give them duration, the expected duration, so that they can plan their work. Of course, that'll be a sort of generalized average, it won't fit everybody, but it's important, again, for us to be taking responsibility to saying how much learning we're trying to provide here. This is a very simple way of providing an opportunity for collaboration. I don't know if people use the Padlet wall here, but it's just such a nice, simple, you know, it's a pinboard. And students can just go and click and say, here's what I think about, this is for a teacher training course. Here's what I think about how we might introduce computational thinking in primary school. And so they've all put up, just open up a little link, they put the URL in, and there's the picture of the place other students can then go through to see what they've done. So those kinds of ways of getting students to collaborate turn out to be real fun, and they love sharing these kinds of ideas. Now that's a lot of work that we're getting them to do without us necessarily being there all the time. We set it up, and we say, find these kinds of things, share them with your friends, with your colleagues and peers, write a little piece about it, go and find someone else's that looks good, comment on theirs. So you're orchestrating, again, the way in which they build on each other's work and give each other feedback. And then another important feature, I think, of this is encouraging student activity within the forums, because very often we find that in online discussion forums, that's just not the engagement of activity that you'd really want. But embedding the forum in the process of doing other things. So in this one, for example, they're reading a document which is a part of a chapter of vignettes of innovative primary schools. And so they're just looking at these little case studies. Then they're asked to select one and write about it and how they would think about using it and record that in their course journal, and then contribute an idea they've had to a specific forum. So it's very specifically tied to that. It's not just join this general forum, it's talk about this. And that sort of process, I think, radically changes the way in which students experience what they're doing in forums. And we did notice this in the MOOC that we were running. In comparison, these are the University of London MOOCs which ran last summer. There were 4 of them on history, creative programming, common law, and mal software. I have no idea what mal software means. Oh, malicious software, yes, that's right. And the percentage of people who registered who are active in week 1, this is one of the features of MOOCs, is you only get barely half of the people who actually register, actually turn up at the first stage. But by week 6, there's still a reasonable proportion of them left. And of those students active in week 6, which is shown here, in each of those courses, a good proportion were watching the videos. The number active in forums you can hardly see. It's the green bits down the bottom. And in our course, it was 39%. Now, that's an order of magnitude different from what the other courses had achieved. And I think that's partly due to that kind of tight relationship between what you do in the forum and the other things that you're doing. And you get something out of it. You're contributing something and you're getting something back. So that idea of the direct click to link the activity to the forum post is important. So when we come to what's going on here in CSU campus and thinking about what is going on in smart learning, I thought this was a nice way of piecing these things together. Smart in other contexts, where it's used in software context, is described as self-monitoring analysis and reporting technology. And I think that's a pretty good way of describing what we're trying to do with the technology. We are doing self-monitoring. We're seeing to what extent are we able to collaborate together to create these kinds of innovative course designs. And then it's also talking about the responsibilities for course design and learning design, which will feed into the learning and teaching. But that creates data because our students are using the technology. So the technology will be collecting a lot of data about student performance, which then supports that collaborative course design process. We're learning a lot from what students are doing. So that, I think, is a perfectly good acronym for what you're doing here as well. It seems to work very well. So when we think back to what it takes to teach with technology, all those difficult things we're doing, we have to note that we don't really know very much about what effect that has on teacher workload. And one of the reasons we don't know it is I've yet to find a university that knows how much its traditional teaching actually costs and what teacher workload is, even in the old ways that we used to do it. As we're moving into using new technology and working online, for all those reasons I was saying right at the beginning, of the fixed costs and the variable costs are different. We've got to understand that, and I want to try and explain how we can do that. And this is a tool called the Course Resource Appraisal Model, which is a tool which simply elicits from teachers the basic arithmetic of what your course is, how many students you've got, how many teaching hours it takes you to prepare the course and to teach the course, what are the different kinds of teaching activity you're doing, and what's the difference between the preparation and support costs for those different kinds. And then it multiplies it all together and adds it all up. So this is the way it looks. You have to put in the details of the credit hours, how many total learning hours you're providing, cohort size, income, teaching income is the fee, and in our institution, about half of the fee goes towards the teaching costs and about half towards the administration, the state's infrastructural costs, and so on. That will probably vary from institution to institution. It looks at the types of learning and teaching and whether it's face-to-face or online and the time it takes teachers to prepare and support each of those different types. So it's eliciting a lot of information from you. And the kind of thing it gives you back is a pie chart of the different kinds of learning opportunity that you're offering, whether it's through learning through acquisition or through discussion, inquiry, production, and so on. And it also, from the information that you've given it, calculates how much time it takes to develop and to support. So as you go over different runs of a course, you can see this very large amount here of preparation time in the red, because the first time you develop it, that's going to be a lot. As you run it again, you're going to be updating it or fixing some of the problems of the first run, and there will be some maintenance costs as you run it again and again. So it's working out, it's giving you a representation of the learning experience and of the teacher preparation time and of the teaching support time. So, for example, if this is from supporting a course that was looking at going online, and this was the current way of doing it face-to-face, where they had 15 students the first year, and then thereafter they had 20. And putting their information in, it became apparent that in terms of the teaching costs, they were not meeting the basic costs in terms of the student fees. We ran the model again by increasing the student numbers. So that was the only change we made, increase the student numbers. And because you're essentially amortizing that preparation cost over a larger number of students, because you've got a large number of students coming here, need a lot of support, but that's a lot of students paying fees. So that by the time you get to the third run, it was actually beginning finally to make a profit, which is fine. You know, if you're having to run it several times. If you think of it in terms of investment and then return on investment, that's fine. But the way that we've traditionally done our courses is to have a budget every year, and then you've got to try and make things work within the year, which is not so sensible. But overall, this is a way of trying to say, are we getting a reasonable student experience? And for that kind of student experience, are we getting reasonable teaching costs and workload? So the way in which you give this information in is you can either use predefined teaching and learning activities, or you can say, I'm going to devise something called collaborative peer feedback. It's running online, it's just peer feedback, and then you go into another panel where you're defining, now this is the pyramid discussion group, and you've already defined the learning opportunities, and now you're defining, let's say, we've got just 1 week of this, and they're doing 10 hours in a summer school or something like that. And how many hours is it going to take you to prepare that 10 hours? It's going to take me 2 hours because I'm very practiced at teaching this, and then I just updated them the later runs. But I have to be there for the pyramid discussion group. I only need to be there for 1 of the hours because the rest of the time they're talking among themselves. So that's the way in which you can get whatever data in that you want. And that's entirely up to the person using it to decide how they want to put it in. When you've got what you want, it then prints it out in a sort of normal Word document, structured Word document form, the sort you might send to a validation committee, along with the information about the learning experience and about the teaching activity costs. So the basic idea of this is to try and understand the costs and benefits of investing in online teaching innovation, to think of this as an investment that will have a return in terms of student benefits, greater flexibility, better quality teaching, more access for students, and in terms of an understanding of what the workload is doing and where the costs are falling. So if we go back to thinking about those pedagogies for supporting large classes, I did try modeling that within that tool to show you how they came out. So if you had a residential school with just those 3 different types of things run in the usual way, just for 1 week, and they've got 10 hours of each different kind of things, just as probably wouldn't actually run such a thing, but just to see the comparison. And the tutor hours are worked out for each of the different runs, for the preparation for the support here. So you can see how that works out there. The student experience is largely personalized because they're all those sort of collaborative techniques. And to some extent, they're the same for all. So the masterclass would be the same for everybody. Everybody's just watching the same video. The learning types are going to be the same in each case, because what I've done here is to turn that into an online summer school. So they're exactly the same things, teaching techniques, but they've now been digitized. And being digitized, you're using the same the same amount of teaching over increasingly larger numbers of students. So I've gone here from 30 to 60 to 60, and in the first one it was all 30, because you've just got the place-based thing. So if you're running online, let's say you double it. If I go up to 90 in the 3rd year, you'll see this number down here change. So here you can say over the 3 years of the run here, 3 runs of the course here, I'm not making any profit because it's face-to-face and I have to be with the students for each of those hours that I'm teaching. Here, because it's running online and it's asynchronous and I've scaffolded the whole thing, I begin to make a profit in the 2nd run and more of a profit in the 3rd run because of the way that I'm running it. Now, you can say, well, it would take me much longer to create this, and in fact I've tripled the amount of time it takes to prepare the online versions in each of these cases, so we've got a much higher preparation time for this one than we had for the other one. This is 40 hours as opposed to just over 10. But even so, because we've got much larger student numbers, we can amortize that over a number of runs, and then we begin to make a bigger profit. So this is all under the control of the course designer. This is not somebody saying, this is what it costs to run this kind of course. This is saying, what's it going to cost me to run this kind of course, this kind of pedagogy for my students? And that's what I think we have to do with online teaching. We have to put that power in the hands of the teachers, because it's the teaching community that's going to be doing this innovation. It's the teaching community that's got to come up with the ideas. It's got to keep renewing its understanding of whatever new technology is coming along and how we make the best of it. So the question is, just to summarize, can we see it this way, that learning through collaboration between teachers sharing these kinds of ideas, working together in the way that the smart tools are working here to bring course teams together around that same collaborative understanding of what you're doing for students. Learning through collaboration is as important for teachers as it is for students. And we have to think of ourselves as continually learning, because We keep getting new technologies. Every day we've got to think about, is this something we can make use of? Nothing is being made for us. I think the tool that I'm talking about here is one of the few, apart from VLEs, which are actually made for teachers. Most of the time we're using things which are made for finance or for the games industry or for business or commerce, all sorts of things. They're not made for education. So we've got to learn a lot and keep learning all the time. And teachers learn about this learning design process by just doing it, but by sharing. And teachers haven't always shared. I don't know what the culture is here, whether you would expect to use what someone else has done and use that, adapt that in your own teaching. Getting reviews, getting peer feedback, as well as basing it on the research and development and on the data we're getting from students. So to harness the learning benefits of technology, we must understand and invest in the teaching costs of sustainable and continuous innovation with technology. So it's not going to be a matter of saying, okay, we're going to change all this now and it's all going to be different. It will keep being different. We've got continuous innovation and change now. And we've got to understand that, cost it, and invest in it, and understand how to get the returns from it. So my final question, I suppose, is what is the role of the senior managers in moving to a different way of thinking about it, a long-term business investment model that will continually support teachers as innovators, not expecting teachers to just leave it to someone else or to just do it in their own time or to rely on the champions, but to make it part of what we all professionally do, that we are all innovators all the time with technology. So that's my question. I very much welcome comments, critiques, challenges, whatever you want to throw. So over to you two.